Some of my favorite videos to make every offseason are redrafts. That being said, I haven't done one yet this summer because I've already done so many and I don't just want to redo the same redrafts every single year. So I was trying to come up with something new that I feel like you guys would like that I haven't done yet, and I went outside the box a little bit. This isn't going to be an NHL entry draft redraft. We're going to be redrafting the 2017 Vegas Golden Knights expansion draft. Now let me be clear, this is just for fun. I'm not saying the team that I drafted would have been better than what Vegas actually drafted, because I mean, they went to the Stanley Cup Finals in their inaugural season, have made the playoffs every season but once, and of course just won the Stanley Cup, so they're doing pretty well. This is actually a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. A lot of what made Vegas so successful out of the gate and what made their expansion draft so good is the trades that they made, racking up multiple first-round draft picks, acquiring the likes of Shea Theodore, Alex Tuck, and Riley Smith. In this redraft, obviously I can't make any trades, so I just went through the list of players made available by all 30 NHL teams and tried to make the best picks possible. If this is your first time checking out the channel and you want more NHL content just like this all year round, hit that subscribe button. We're getting super close to 75,000. So with that all being said, let's go ahead and bring up the draft board. Those numbers you see up in the top right are just the minimum requirements of players you have to draft by each position. I used that so I could kind of keep track of where I was at as I was going through the draft, so I didn't finish with, 20 defensemen or something like that. Let's get the draft started with the Anaheim Ducks. This was an easy one for me. I went with defenseman Josh Manson. He's no Shea Theodore, of course, but Manson has been a very steady top 4 defenseman for like 6 or 7 seasons now. Manson would have been just 25 years old during the Golden Knights inaugural season, so you have to imagine they would have got some really productive years out of him. Next up, we have the Arizona Coyotes, and man, was it slim pickings in terms of players that Vegas could have selected from the Yotes. In real life, they went with Timo Pulkkinen, who played 1 season for the Golden Knights organization in the American Hockey League after the expansion draft, and then has been in the KHL ever since. I decided to go with defenseman Kevin Connauton because I think he might be the only player that was on the list of available players you could take from Arizona that's still under an NHL contract today. Now, Connauton has never really been anything more than a depth defenseman, a fine number 7, number 8 guy, but I feel like he was definitely the best option from the Coyotes. Moving on now, next up we have the Boston Bruins, and I went with defenseman Colin Miller, who Vegas did actually select in the real expansion draft, and Colin Miller had his best NHL season in the Golden Knights inaugural year. He had 10 goals, which was a career high, 41 points, also a career high. I think Colin Miller was definitely the right choice there. The Buffalo Sabres are up next, and we have another player that Vegas did actually take in real life, Will Carrier, and who would have thought that Will Carrier would be one of the last few remaining players still on the Golden Knights all these years later that they actually selected in the expansion draft. And Carrier is a guy who's gotten better for Vegas year after year and really peaked this past season, scoring a career high 16 goals in just 56 games. He's an incredible forechecker and really just the ideal bottom 6 forward. Definitely the right choice from the Buffalo Sabres. Next up, we have the Calgary Flames. Now in real life, Vegas selected Derek Englund, who they would go on to make their inaugural captain. I'm not going to choose Englund here just because I already have 3 defensemen and I don't want, every pick to be what Vegas actually did. So I decided to go with Alex Chason, somebody who scored 22 goals and put up 38 points with the Edmonton Oilers in the 2018-19 season, and throughout his career, he's really been a power play specialist, not somebody who's going to play big minutes at 5-on-5, but a good bumper net front guy on the power play for sure. Next up, we have the Carolina Hurricanes, and similar to what I said about Arizona, very slim pickings here. Carolina was obviously not anywhere close to the organization they are now back in 2017. I decided to go with Patrick Brown, really the only guy on the list of players that they made available that has had really any kind of success at the NHL level since the expansion draft. And it's not like Patrick Brown has ever been a guy who's going to be in the lineup every single night. He's a big physical depth centerman, but I feel like he was really the only choice from Carolina. Moving along now, next up we have the Chicago Blackhawks. I decided to go with defenseman Trevor Van Riemsdyk, who throughout his entire career has always been a steady, consistent, bottom pairing depth defenseman. Not anything too exciting, of course, but I think would have made the best option from the Blackhawks. Next up we have the Colorado Avalanche. In the actual expansion draft, Vegas selected goaltender Calvin Pickard. I elected to go with forward Carl Soderberg, who's actually no longer playing in the NHL. He's been playing in the Swedish Hockey League over the past 2 seasons, but in the 3 seasons following the expansion draft in 17-18, Soderberg scored 16 goals, scored 23 goals in 18-19, and 17 goals in 19-20. Likely would have given the Vegas Golden Knights some really productive seasons down the middle. The Columbus Blue Jackets are up next, and this is an easy one. It has to be William Karlsson, Wild Bill, who Vegas did actually, of course, select in the expansion draft. And I mean, Karlsson was their superstar during their inaugural season. The man scored 43 goals, which was one of the most random breakout seasons, in my opinion, opinion, in NHL history. William Karlsson has been one of the faces of the Vegas Golden Knights franchise since the expansion draft. One of the few players that is still there, that has made it all these years without being traded or leaving in free agency. This was an unreal pick. Next up, we have the Dallas Stars. In the actual expansion draft, Vegas selected Cody Eakin, who wound up being a really productive player for them for 3 seasons. In 18-19, had a career-high 22 goals, but I actually decided to go with a different player. I'm going with defenseman Jamie Alexiak. Over the past 4 seasons, Alexiak has developed into a solid top 4 defenseman. Obviously, he's very physically imposing. The man is a monster, 6'7", plays a very physical game, and actually he's coming off of a season in which he put up a career-high 25 points. Moving along now, next up we have the Detroit Red Wings. I actually made a tweet last night when doing my research and making my picks for this video that the Red Wings actually protected Justin Abdelkader in this expansion draft, which is something I completely forgot about, and it's just insane to think back on. But the pick I'm going with from the Red Wings is Thomas Nosek, who Vegas did actually select in the expansion draft. He was the right pick, just 24 years old at the time of the expansion draft, an unestablished player, but immediately after the expansion draft, Thomas Nosek proved that he can be a very valuable bottom 6 forward, not somebody with a ton of offensive upside. He's never cracked 20 points in a single season, but he's somebody who's going to be tough to play against. He's got a high motor, good forechecker, decent on the penalty kill, and overall just a useful utility player. Moving along now, next up we have the Edmonton Oilers. I decided to go with forward Jujhar Khaira. His first full NHL season was actually the Golden Knights' inaugural season in 2017-18. He scored 11 goals, put up 21 points in 69 games with the Oilers. Since then, hasn't really been able to replicate that kind of offensive production, but still has been, an NHL caliber bottom 6 grinder type winger who plays a heavy physical style. Next up, we have the Florida Panthers, and man, did they ever help Vegas out in a big way during the expansion draft. I believe the trade was Florida sent Riley Smith to the Vegas Golden Knights in order for Vegas to select Jonathan Marchessault, and obviously both of those guys ended up being huge pieces for Vegas, and Marchessault of course still is. Another player who was left unprotected by the Panthers in this expansion draft is actually Mackenzie Weegar, which is pretty crazy to look back on. Now, I am going to go with Jonathan Marchessault though still, because it would feel wrong not to. The dude just led Vegas to the Stanley Cup, won the Conn Smythe's playoffs MVP with 25 points in 22 games. He's another guy like William Karlsson who's been one of the faces of the franchise since the expansion draft and really still is. Mackenzie Weegar would have been a fun option though. Next up we have the Los Angeles Kings, and I'm going with another guy who Vegas actually took in real life, defenseman Brayden McNabb. And similar to William Carrier, who would have thought that Brayden McNabb would be one of those guys who's still on the team from the expansion draft. McNabb has been solid as a rock for the Vegas Golden Knights though over the years. Never a guy you hear anything about, really low maintenance, and has definitely turned out to be a fantastic pick from the Kings. Next up we have the Minnesota Wild, and I decided to go with the first goaltender Darcy Kemper. Now at the time of the expansion draft, Darcy Kemper had really yet to break out and become a full-time starter. All of his best years really came after the expansion draft, so I think Kemper would have ended up being a really good pick if they decided to go that route. The Wild did also have some other really intriguing options though, like Eric Stahl, Eric Haula, and Matt Dumba. The Montreal Canadiens are up next, and I went with a little bit of a fun one here, Alexander Radulov. Now of course Radulov is no longer playing in the NHL. He has since gone back to play in Russia after a very disappointing final season in Dallas, but Radulov's 2 seasons after the expansion draft, 17-18 and 18-19, were the best seasons of his career. 72 points in each of those seasons, 25 plus goals. This would have given Vegas a legit top line forward for a couple of seasons right out of the gate. Prime Alexander Radulov was a lot of fun to watch, and somebody who I think would have quickly became a fan favorite for the Golden Knights in their first couple seasons. Next up we have the Nashville Predators, and not going to change history here. I'm definitely going with James Neal like they did in real life. He was only a part of the Golden Knights for 1 season, and it was their inaugural year, but man, that was a fun version of James Neal. He scored 25 goals in 71 games. If I remember correctly, I think he had like a 4-goal game real early on in the season, which was a huge story. That 1 season of James Neal was 1000% worth the pick. The New Jersey Devils are up next. Not a whole lot to choose from here, so I decided to go with defenseman John Merrill, who I believe Vegas went with in the actual expansion draft. He's been, a solid depth, maybe number 7, number 8 defenseman for the majority of his career. Don't really think there was any better options available from the New Jersey Devils. Next up, we have the New York Islanders. I decided to go with centerman Ryan Strome, a former 5th overall draft pick by the Islanders in 2011. And when it comes to Strome, the majority of his best seasons in his career all came after the Vegas expansion draft. So I feel like this would have wound up being a pretty solid pick for Vegas. And considering the fact that almost everybody on that inaugural Vegas team broke out in their first season, I think Ryan Strome would have been one of those guys, and potentially could have been a top 6 center for Vegas for a while. The New York Rangers are up next, and I'm going with another goaltender here, Antti Raanta, who throughout his career has always been a fantastic classic backup and sometimes even playing the role of like a 1B to somebody else's 1A. So I think he would have been a solid option from the Rangers. They're really the only other guy on there that I think would have made any sense. Looking back at it now, Jesper Faust, but you needed at least 3 goaltenders, so had to get them somewhere. The Ottawa Senators are up next. I went with defenseman Mark Borowiecki. Still never really nailed down how to say his name. It's spelled super weird, but he's one of those guys who I think 1000% would have been a fan favorite in Vegas immediately. He's a tough guy. He's got no front teeth, loves to fight. What's not to love? Somebody like Bobby Ryan was available to be taken from the Ottawa Senators, who's obviously a bigger name, but I don't think it would have made any sense for Vegas to take on that contract. Moving on now, we have the Philadelphia Flyers, and I feel like the only pick that makes any sense is Pierre-Edouard Bellemare, who Vegas did select in the actual draft. Not really many other options from Philadelphia at all. I mean, maybe a Michael Del Zotto, but I definitely think Bellemare was the pick. Real solid fourth line center, and actually had some good seasons with the Golden Knights. Next up, we have the Pittsburgh Penguins, and as much as I want to go with somebody like Brian Russ, who would have been an amazing pick, it's got to be Marc-Andre Fleury. Marc-Andre Fleury was the first face of the Vegas Golden Knights franchise. You saw his face everywhere during their inaugural season. One of the most beloved players in the league, and really just a perfect guy to kind of build your franchise around right out of the gate, on the ice and off the ice. And as we know, Marc-Andre Fleury had some fantastic seasons with the Golden Knights, including winning a Vezina Trophy, which was the one and only in his career, so far at least. Next up, we have the San Jose Sharks, who actually left Joe Thornton unprotected. I remember that was a big story. I almost went with him just for fun, but I don't think that would have made sense for Vegas. Decided to go with Barclay Goodrow, who I think would have been a great pick. Imagine a fourth line right out of the gate, including the likes of Will Carrier and Barclay Goodrow. That line would have wreaked havoc. Some other guys that would have made pretty solid picks as well, Brendan Dillon and Dylan DeMello. Next up, we have the St. Louis Blues. Another easy one here. Another player that Vegas did actually take in real life, David Perron, and he was only in Vegas for one season, but man, that one season was definitely worth the pick. In just 70 games, David Perron put up 16 goals and a career high 66 points. He was one of those guys, along with the likes of James Neal and many others, that really made that inaugural Vegas team special. Next up, we have the Tampa Bay Lightning, and this is a pretty good one, Yanni Gourde, who prior to the expansion draft had played just 22 career NHL games, had really yet to burst onto the scene and break out, but in Vegas' inaugural season with the Lightning though, Yanni Gourde put up 25 goals and a career high 64 points. He would have made an amazing pick. Now, although Yanni Gourde missed out on being selected by the Golden Knights in this expansion draft, he of course would later go on to be selected by the Seattle Kraken in their expansion draft in 2021 after winning 2 cups with the Lightning. Moving along now, next up we have the Toronto Maple Leafs, who obviously at the time of the expansion draft were a very bad team, slim pickings in terms of the players they could choose from, but I decided to go with Brian Boyle, another one of those guys that I feel like would have been a fan favorite immediately in Vegas, maybe gave them a couple strong seasons in their bottom 6 because he did have a few seasons where he was relatively productive following the expansion draft. Next up we have the Vancouver Canucks. Nothing really too exciting here. Decided to go with defenseman Alex Biega, I guess. Obviously has since retired, but did have a few seasons following the expansion draft where he was a fine bottom pairing or extra, number 7, number 8 defenseman. Moving on now to the Washington Capitals. This is an easy one. It's got to be Nate Schmidt, who of course Vegas did end up taking in the actual expansion draft, and Nate Schmidt really broke out in Vegas. He had 3 very strong seasons with the team before then being traded to the Vancouver Canucks in a cap dump, which I remember was, kind of an unpopular move amongst Vegas Golden Knights fans because, again, I know I've said this a lot in this video, he was, one of those guys that made that inaugural team so special. He was one of the fan favorites, and even though his tenure with the team might have ended, poorly in terms of fans being unhappy with how he was just shipped out in a cap dump, he was definitely the right pick. I think in real life, the Vegas Golden Knights actually ended up getting Chris Thorburn because Winnipeg gave them a first-round pick in order to take Thorburn. Probably they wanted to protect a guy like Ben Sherratt, but Ben Sherratt, his best seasons really came after the expansion draft in 18-19 and in 19-20. Somebody who obviously at this point in his career is a pretty polarizing player, but I do believe that Ben Sherratt probably would have done pretty well in the early years of the Golden Knights. So that is going to wrap up today's video redrafting the 2017 Vegas Golden Knights expansion draft. I had a lot of fun putting this video together. Again, like I said at the beginning, this is just for fun. Don't take it too seriously. I'm not saying this team would have done better than how Vegas actually did because, again, that would have been impossible. They made it to the Stanley Cup Finals, and they've obviously done some amazing things, including winning a Stanley Cup since coming into the league just a short time ago. If you guys enjoyed this video, please go ahead and leave it a like. That is the best way to let me know that you enjoyed, the best way to show your support. And most importantly, if this was your first time checking out the channel and you want more NHL content just like this all year round, hit that subscribe button, and I'll talk to you all soon.